Welcome to the Twin Bill Podcast. I'm your host, Scott Bolohan. This week, we're joined by John Cheslock and Leroy Estep of the Baseball Book Club podcast, a fantastic new podcast where they discuss, you guessed it, baseball books. While we usually focus on a different book each week, they go in-depth on the books, making it easy for you to follow along on your own. Plus, they're really fun and knowledgeable guys. I had a great time talking to them. I've listened to all their episodes, and I really love the podcast, and I'm sure our listeners would as well. Enjoy. How you guys doing? Actually, do you guys want to introduce yourself so people can understand and figure out whose voice is who's here?
Yes. John, do you want to go first?
I suppose I will. Yeah, I'm John Cheslock, and I'm one half of the Baseball Book Club. And Scott, thank you so much for having us on. This is such a privilege, and we are so excited to be here.
Oh, my pleasure.
And my name is Leroy Estep, and I'm the heavier half of the Baseball Book Club. Nevertheless, John more than pulls his weight, no pun intended. But yes, we're a new podcast, just getting things kicked off, and we're having a lot of fun with it. So yeah, thank you so much for having us, Scott. I appreciate it.
Oh, it's been great. I've listened to every episode. It's you're in my download queue. It's been great. Yeah, I'm really enjoying it.
Thank you.
So where did this idea start for you guys?
So having been in a fantasy baseball league together, we started a private podcast together for that league. And, we had a lot of fun with it, but, 6 or 8 guys were listening and we're like, you know what, let's just do the real thing, so we just kind of jumped into it.
Yeah, it was the evolution from necessity of having to communicate nationwide with people who, could we call it a schism, John, that the fantasy baseball league was having a schism of sorts. And so there was a podcast created for the league to address everybody, what was going on and to quell the drama. And eventually it evolved into you and I just for entertainment purposes and saying, look, here's the yearly rule changes, etc. And we thought we'd do a couple entertaining segments. And the next thing you know, just like John said, it's like, well, we're doing this for 8-10 guys. Like maybe try and up our game. So here we are.
I love the idea of a fantasy baseball podcast. I'm obsessed with my fantasy baseball leagues. Like, it's playoff time. That is all I really care about right now. Mm-hmm. That had to be so much fun for you guys to do.
It was a blast. And when the playoffs came around, we were doing like what we were doing, Leroy, probably one every 6 weeks.
Yeah.
And then when the playoffs came around, we were going weekly, but the shorter, and just kind of like really hammering away at what was going on. And that was a lot of fun.
Yeah, and it centered more upon league analysis, which is harder to do than let's talk about the roster for the Los Angeles Angels. We got to remember, oh yeah, that's right, Ben Olsen is playing for the Mud Hens, and you've got to figure out who all these people are playing for and synthesize this league review that makes sense, that's completely removed from who's really on what baseball roster.
And I had my dad kind of check in a couple times and listen to it, and it really didn't resonate with him at all.
No. Okay. How could it? Like, fantasy stories are the worst stories.
It started with that generally, and then just for entertainment purposes, we threw a couple little spots in and figured we would roll with it. We're a lot less about what's happening right now in baseball, who's breaking a current record, anything like that. Biographies, I think, John, would probably be the core of what we talk about.
Yeah, I think we touch a little bit more on like baseball history and maybe like significant moments in history or significant plays or players.
Scott, you've listened to the pod. I think something that I'm usually hammering around is the cultural significance of baseball and why it moves us so deeply as Americans and why it's so integral and entrained into not only our vernacular and the way we express ourselves, but the way we conceive of recreation and entertainment, and sports media. So you can tell a lot about not just the history, but the cultural development of the country. But I always like to take it back to who we are as people, as sports fans, and the language that we can speak together communally. And there's obviously a trove of historical information that we're never going to be at a loss for material.
Right.
So that's kind of what we're going for.
Where did the idea for books come in?
When we were coming up with the idea to do the podcast, we were kind of like, well, how do we want to approach this? And after a couple of weeks of silence, we kind of came back together and we both had the idea of doing books. It was crazy. It was like kismet,
Yeah.
Right, Leroy? I mean, we just...
Oh, yeah.
we both you decided on the biographical part of it, and I was kind of thinking like short stories, so kind of a combination.
Yeah, well, and I think the thing about the book club that we're really going for is that to pontificate behind a microphone to a blank screen to an audience that you don't see, you don't interact with, you don't know. I mean, that just sounds like a drag to us. So the whole idea of making the baseball book club, it's an open invitation. The same way you'd get together, this is the book we're reading this week, and you get together at your buddy's house, your aunt's house, or whoever's doing the book club, and everybody sits around and talks about it. We're kind of trying to recreate that same experience with an audience, is that we want to be able to converse and reach out and talk and disagree sometimes and let that be okay, And so we figured, well, as far as being a club and having interaction, well, we need something to rally the whole thing around, and books, texts, well, that seemed like a good anchoring spot to get the whole community together.
So for people who are not longtime listeners like myself, what are you actually focusing on this season?
So we have 3 books that we're going through, and we're about to add in a 4th book. But the primary book that we're going through is Joe Posnanski's The Baseball 100, which is his top 100 ranking of all-time baseball greats. That's our basic go-to, right, Leroy?
Yep, that's it. The baseball book club, the baseball 100, Joe Posnanski. That's kind of the first text that, and the reason is because it's easily digestible. It's in 100 segments, 100 players, so we can spend a little bit of time or a lot of time, depending on the magnitude of the player, and be able to put it in digestible quantities. And that's a good thing that I was really attracted to about Joe Posnanski's book is a lot of his books actually. If you're a busy person. And we were talking pre-production here. We were having a conversation about how much time we actually have to read and digest material, and it can be overwhelming and preparing for a show. But the one thing that we enjoyed about the baseball 100 is that no matter how busy you are, it's easy to pick up and put down and digest in small quantities, but you can also get kind of a big collective aggregate picture of the entire book and the way he structures things out. So we just thought it would be a really good focal text to rally around. So yeah, that would be one. I think, what did we say, 3 or 4, John? I think we'll talk about number 2.
Yeah, the second one is the Baseball Dictionary by Paul Dixon. And this one's been already for us so far. It's been a lot of fun because it takes us through a lot of, baseball slang that either stuff you hear every day if you're watching a baseball game, or stuff that's kind of obsolete. Like we went through one recently called, what was it? The wagon tongue, which is 1800s term.
Right.
Quality Strikes was great too. I didn't know the Texas Leaguer origin. That was fantastic to learn.
Yeah.
This book has been just awesome so far to go through, and I'm so excited about continuing on.
I think the other aspect of why we enjoy this text is for what you just said, is we talked about the wagon tongue, right? Well, neither of us were really all that familiar with what it was. And you've heard the old adage, in order to teach something, you really have to know it. Wow, you really realize how little you know about a topic once you get ready for a podcast and have to start talking to somebody else about it.
That is so true. Yeah.
I'm like, I need to take notes and make sure I'm ready to really go here. And so when it came to the dictionary book, it was another text that we could tackle in easily digestible pieces because we could just take one little term at a time. But when it came to something like a wagon tongue, which, if for the listener who doesn't know, a wagon tongue is a 1800s term for a baseball bat. And that used to be a bragging point of a baseball bat production company, is that, big straw, you'd swing a big wagon tongue that's made for hauling horses around, Well, that betrays a certain mindset of the 1800s idea of what it meant to be a good hitter, which is big, burly, strapping guys like Jimmy Fox with a split-handed batting style, bare-handed, swinging the lumber like Paul Bunyan, right?
Yep.
Well, then you get into the 60s with Ernie Banks, and it's all about quick wrists and quick feet and bat speed. So, and just going over a term like that, you can really kind of unpack how the game has changed and how our awareness have changed about it over the years. So, another text that we're playing with is the baseball's best short stories, and I always butcher this pronunciation, but it's Stoudahar, right,
Yeah,
John?
you always drop the T. I think it's Stoudahar.
Paul Stoudahar. It was a 1995 collection of fiction stories, but it has some real classics in it. Like I said, we always like to make the significance of what we're covering reflect our development as a sport and a culture and as a cultural history. So we were talking off air, you were mentioning Sid Finch, that you were acquainted with Sid Finch. Well, the Sid Finch story that was in Sports Illustrated is in the Stoudahar book.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, along with an interesting story that we covered this season by Zane Grey, who most people would know Zane Grey as the famous Western writer.
Like a Louis L'Amour.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Who wrote prolifically in the Western genre, but took a swing, no pun intended, at the most fashionable, in vogue fictional style of the day in the early 1900s or late 1800s, which was baseball. It was the hottest thing in the late 1800s. And so he made his take on it.
The other one's Casey at the Bat.
That's right. And it's not the original Casey at the Bat. This is for the 100th anniversary of Casey at the Bat, a retelling by, let me get it, is it Frank DeFord? Who I say Frank Delford about half a dozen times during the pod. So, but anyway, so a lot of treats with the fiction as well. And I think those are kind of the three major. What was the fourth one that you had in mind, John?
Oh, it was Posnanski's Why We Love Baseball.
Oh,
and we're gonna bring that in a couple of weeks when we talk about Larry Walker. So it's going to be the fourth book will be added in, but that's going to be a bigger bulk of season 2 from that book.
Yeah.
That's great. I love that you're not just doing one book, that you really have a wide scope. I think baseball fiction is very overlooked. We publish short stories all the time, and there's not a lot of places that are publishing baseball short stories these days.
No.
So I'm really happy that because I think it is such a part of the culture, such a part of what makes baseball what it is. I wanted to go back to the Baseball 100. You guys talked about Mike Mussina. I don't think he's a top 100 guy.
We're with you.
Just going to throw that out there. I don't get it. I personally don't. But I thought it was also interesting that it wasn't just a debate about him as a player. You really sort of analyzed Posnanski's writing and thoughts. It really is related to the book. It's not just a jumping off point for a statistical debate or anything like that.
Yeah, thanks for validating that I'm not insane, because I read that into that. I'm like, I think he's got a special affinity for Mussina. He's drawing a comparison that good at a lot, but never so overwhelmingly good. He's a mensch. He's good enough when it counts. That's
I guess. I don't know. I mean, when I think of great pitchers of the 90s, he would never be one of them. I don't know.
John, I think you were a little hotter on Mussina at 100 than I was, or did I have that flip-flopped?
Oh, I think he would probably make the 150, maybe. That's kind of where I thought he would be. If we were going to go like a top 150, I think he might make that. But no, I didn't like him at 9. What was it, 99? No.
He's 99, yeah.
99.
And I took Ichiro over Mike Mussina.
Oh, 100%. Like, not even a question. Not even a question.
Same. Yeah. And that's the kind of the fun thing about that Baseball 102 going backwards is that none of us are agreeing that Mussina belongs with where he's at. And like I mentioned, I think during the pod, I think that's part of Posnanski's point. Is he challenges the reader from the very beginning. He says, this is a dialogue. It is not coming down on stone tablets. This is something that's meant to engage your analytical thought. And that's part of the participatory process. And I think it was Joe Posnanski in some ways laying down the gauntlet for the reader saying, come at me. You loved Ichiro. Well, let's see what you do with this. Are you going to talk back?
Well, especially because you could very easily look at the top 100 WAR players in history. So I do think that there is something there to it. I never thought I'd be arguing about Mike Mussina in my life. So this is it. Actually, you know what? So I think that this is already some sort of success for the book and justifying it. Yeah. So
that we got somewhere with it.
And Leroy and I have had that conversation with regards to WAR and OPS plus, and you could just take the easy way out and just go with a ranking based on those numbers. But it's not so cut and dried. So, but yeah, it's a debate, and that's what makes it fun.
I think people over rely upon WAR to really define the value definitively of a player. And I think you can rank somebody in the relevancy of a franchise, or, you can get somebody in the conversation with WAR, but there's a lot of aspects of the calculation of that stat. In the previous podcast that we spoke of for the Fantasy Baseball League, John and I did our top 5 all time at every position. And that's hard to come up with 5 first basemen. I mean, try it. It's tough to come up with 5 all-time first basemen and leave somebody off of that Mount Rushmore. But even Mount Rushmore's got 4 people. But anyways, my point being is that sometimes the question I had to ask myself is, okay, this is a 9-on-9 baseball to save the world, man. Like, who are you putting out there to be part of the team?
Right.
Who do you want for the 7th game of the World Series? Is it Barry Bonds? Never mind the stats. Is that the guy? And sometimes that made the decision. I mean, you got to rely upon the stats, and you got to rely a little bit on WAR, but so many times it was the intangibles that actually mean something, which is obviously why a player like Ichiro would, to me, seem to rank higher than Mussina. But, flash counts for an awful lot too, and Mussina was not a flashy player.
No, he wasn't. Yeah.
For the record, Mike Mussina's career WAR is 82.8. And Ichiro's is 68.9. Yeah, But again, Ichiro, also lost half his career. And frankly, I think that we also somewhat overrate Ichiro because he was just a singles hitter, but he was just a fun singles hitter. If he wasn't so much fun, I think that we would view him very differently. So, and that's not showing up in the stats there either. So
the allure for Ichiro Suzuki for me, during Ichiro Mania, if that was a thing, had a lot more to do with just being impressed as an American from someone with a different culture coming in and bringing such a dignified, disciplined, and dare I say mysterious air to the game, which seemed to turn it into an art form instead of just, turning the guys and the spitting seeds in the dugout. It caught everybody's imagination and attention as though it was somehow a martial art hitting in the box now.
Do you remember he would travel with those? He had a case for his bats. Am I making this up? I swear he had a metal case for. And if I'm making it up, that's a thing he would totally do. I believe it. Yeah.
I don't know if you made it up or not, but I think now you've shared it into my collective consciousness. So I'm going to remember it that way. But it does seem like something that Ichiro would do, isn't it? Is that to hone the bat with some kind of special ointment or bone or whatever. And then, of course, the thing that also fed into that was that magnificent, the stance that he took, the stretching his arm out in front of him as he pointed out into center field. So legend can help us remember so many amazing things about players that we wouldn't otherwise. Unfortunately, to not keep picking on Mike Mussina, but Mike Mussina is just not making the cut in the collective imagination.
Can you think of one single Mike Mussina moment?
Yes, I do. You got one?
Are you going to the smile, Leroy?
Yes, I am. So my Mike Mussina moment was during that 2001 World Series, which for everybody who was old enough, that was just a magical World Series because of what was going on at the time. Everything was just hyper focused and sensitive, And so I remember there was a moment where Mussina was having a start on the mound, and he was shaking off Jorge Posada's signs. He always had that kind of grumpy, disinterested scowl when he shook off the first call and stared, and the cameras, scanning into the void of his face, and he shakes off the second call, and then the third call comes through from Posada, and this wicked smile slowly creeps across his face, just pure confidence of yeah, Jorge, that's the one, baby. That was my Mike Mussina moment. Is oh man, this is a guy getting down to work, So yeah, that's what I was this is
that's pretty good. That's pretty good. I don't have one personally, but that's a good one. That's a really good one.
Yeah, I don't have one. I think most of his career is kind of a blur of just steady Eddie, really nothing really stands out when I think about Mike Mussina, except for, maybe a couple times where he was close to perfect game and it didn't quite, wasn't able to finish.
Well, and that's part of Poznansky's point, isn't it? Is that his legacy is almost but not quite.
Right.
And almost kind of implies that he's almost but not quite on purpose to be modest. It almost seems like the implication in the book. But there's a lot of ninth inning snuff outs of perfect games and no hitters. And that almost were, but I like Mussina, but
Yeah.
as far as ball player, top 100.
Well, he's a likable guy, but yeah, I just don't think I don't think he makes the cut,
No.
but yeah.
Well, if this has become a full-on Mike Mussina hate podcast now, but this is we're gonna pull it back in. Baseball books. I remember growing up and reading like Matt Christopher books, and then slowly getting into biographies as I got older. What is your history with baseball books?
I really don't have much of a history with baseball books. I've been more of a fictional reader throughout my life. Never really been a nonfiction reader, and so this has definitely been a different experience for me acquiring some of these, nonfiction books and going through them. And it's been really enjoyable. I had the Baseball's Best Short Stories for a long time, and I loved that book. And I've read all those stories, but I've never been a baseball book reader.
So I have been a voracious reader for most of my life. And I remember it must have been around 2001, because I think that's when it came out, was Moneyball.
Yeah.
Now, I've always been a baseball fan and, mess with the cards and Stratomatic and MLB The Show or whatever. I consume the product and watch play the DraftKings and the fantasy and all that sometimes. But when it comes to baseball books, I just took it on a recommendation that Moneyball was one of the best books that you'll ever read by Michael
Lewis.
Michael Lewis, that's right.
Yeah.
I was about to say Creighton, and I knew that wasn't right. Michael Lewis, yeah.
I'd like to read that one, though. That'd be great, yeah.
That's the spooky version. The thriller. But yeah, so Moneyball, so I just took it on from a recommendation of that it was just a piece of quality literature. I am not a fiction guy, however. I vary from John in that way. I just, I get lost in fiction and have to keep going back. I've got just got a brain for nonfiction. So that's usually my go-to, and it really caught my attention. And I was so engaged with Michael Lewis's work in that book. It kind of put me on a reading spree. I read George Will's book, and took a couple other swings at some other books, and so I've kind of put them up and down, and I read Ball 4, which I thought was fantastic.
I love that book, yeah.
Yeah, isn't that just great? And that's something that we should cover, John, is talk about a book that really changed the general consciousness of what ball players were all about and what was happening in the locker rooms of the sport, Being a baseball fan, oddly enough, it feels like I always get the fever right around December, around the hot stove time. That's when I'm the most enthusiastic. It could be the weather. I'm dreaming of green grass. I don't know. But for whatever it is, it seems like that's the one I do the most reading. And it tends to be about baseball books. And that's when I break out the Ken Burns series and all that jazz. So, yeah, I think that maybe that's why I suggested it, John, is because I think I have a little bit of an itch to scratch, is that anytime I'm enthusiastic about something, I want to read something nonfiction about it to figure out how it works or to know more about it.
One of the features in the show is the Leroy Hot Corner. So tell the listeners about that a little bit.
Well, so Leroy's Hot Corner is just it's hard to know sometimes whether or not you want to review a book and make an entire show about it, or whether or not you just want to make a recommendation. And so I just figured it was a good little segment to hear 8, 10, 12 minutes here or there, not to go super deep, but to basically do my adult version of a book report, where I basically say, here's what I've been looking at. You should look at it too. And here's all the great features of what could be going on. And we've done the Wax Pack this season, which I read just recently, which was fantastic. And another one that we've done that I covered for the Hot Corner is actually probably my favorite baseball book of all time is Ladies and Gentlemen, The Bronx is Burning. And I don't know if you've read or
I read that this offseason as well. Yeah. I have the same thing. Like December, I'm like, give me a baseball book. It keeps it alive for me.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, the integration between the politics and the culture and what's going on in the music scene, and being a big music lover and punk rock lover myself, and digging into the gritty underbelly of New York, and have it seamlessly coincide with the day-to-day in and out dog days of the Yankees, trying to make the plane in Chicago and bickering with each other. So it was really one of my favorite, most immersive baseball books. I mean, by the end of it, not only are you kind of a Yankees fan, even if you don't want to be, but man, you can smell New York City,
Yeah.
And those are just the best kind of books for me that give you just a little bit of everything.
Yeah.
We did Leroy's Hot Corner on our previous podcast, and Leroy covered the Reggie Jackson special on, was it Netflix or something?
Yeah, I came out within the last couple of years.
Yeah, that one. And then also, what did you do, Leroy? It was titled War, but it wasn't Stat War. It was a Memorial Day special where you covered veterans of World War II in baseball. Right.
I went through a kind of a timeline and a kind of a quick story time of what we know of all of the Major League Baseball active players throughout history who had died in service to the United States military. And and so and there's obviously like the most probably renowned MLB story, would it be Ted Williams, fighter pilot Ted Williams? I mean, that
as far
seems
as
like
Memorial,
yeah. I mean, but he made it. He's the World War II pilot, and so. But there's a lot of guys who didn't make it, and their stories are, in some ways, almost overshadow Ted Williams' stories because of the poignancy of the little window that they got. Of the Field of Dreams, that little slice of summer that they got compared to, well, what they gave it all up for and the environment and the theater that they went to. It was a different time then where it was more important to go do this thing than it was to play a boys' game for money, And of course, that's before the enormous media machine got behind professional sports, before television even so much got off of the ground, which kind of transformed the way we experience and digest not only the game itself, but the personalities who play it. Which is why it seems like I always want to talk about Reggie Jackson. It was such a huge,
the first TV superstar.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, in a game that Babe Ruth saved, in the 20s, which was a radio era, the player who in some ways saved baseball in the televised era was Reggie Jackson. And the straw that stirs the drink, and the big, huge personality with the sunglasses and the candy bars. That's the flash that gets everybody going today.
It's interesting. So now we are clearly in the internet era, and I don't know if baseball has found their Reggie Jackson or their Babe Ruth for the internet. You look at football, and football's been able to surpass it and really capitalize on the internet culture. And baseball hasn't quite figured out how to do that. I don't know if there's an answer, if I'm missing somebody, but it seems like they haven't quite figured it out how to handle that yet.
Yeah, no, I think you're right about that. I think it's almost like, Leroy, you and I talked about it a couple of weeks ago where you had said you're almost okay if baseball were to slip into that periphery type sport, and I almost feel like it has in a way.
Yeah, I wonder if that's true or not, but I'm not going to change the entire game bending over backwards to get casual people who are not going to be here for the sport to like it. I mean, they're sometimes saving the soul of the sport for the people who are really going to be there and who are real fans. It's okay not to be the number one thing at everything. And now that doesn't mean that I don't like the pitch clock. It doesn't mean that I don't like the bases. It doesn't mean, there's pluses to all that stuff. And I understand why they do it. But I think jockeying for the kind of attention, which is we need to compete with the NBA and the NFL, you don't need to do that when you're baseball. Other than we got to do it because we got to make as much money as possible. But really, I just don't feel like the sport needs that. And so I'd be fine with baseball being more of a niche sport. I mean, no one's ever going to allow that to happen. But when it comes to who is the representative superstar that's going to pick the sport up on their shoulders and really redeem it for the 21st century crowd, I think what would be really helpful is we could keep some guys like Trout and Judge healthy for entire seasons without any of that drama going on. And in some ways, I think that might be the answer to your question. Is the real culprit here is, where's Johnny Hero? Can he stay healthy? Where's the big guy? Because they keep going down. There's a few pitchers who should be taking that place right now, and they're not here.
Yeah. I mean, right there, I had Tommy John surgery. That is a story of baseball right now, is Tommy John and injuries. And we've almost broken the game with how good we are now at playing the sport. It's actually breaking the people who play it, and I don't see how that goes back. I don't see how you put that. You can't put the toothpaste back in the tube. You can't. No one's gonna be like, well, I can throw 99, 100, whatever. I'm just gonna throw 92 now. Yeah, I know they're talking about those like 5-inning minimums for starting pitchers or whatever, but like it's not gonna happen.
Well, and to even be noticed in the youth game these days, you've got to stick out. There's a lot of pay to play. There's a lot of so if you don't have that stat, if you don't have that wow, if you don't have the time, the Super League, all of that, if you could be left behind.
Yeah. No, you're right, Scott. It's not going to go back. We've crossed that that threshold where you can't go back.
And you know what? Throwing 100's awesome. I wish I could throw 100. Like that's so cool that everyone can do it now. But it also means that it's a less interesting game in some ways. Maybe, I don't know. It'll adjust. Baseball always adjusts. It always changes. It evolves always. I think you're seeing teams like Cleveland who have figured out, hey, what if we just like put the ball in play a lot? Like that does okay. So it's going to keep evolving. I'm not worried about the future of baseball, but I don't know. I don't think we're in the best place ever right now.
Well, Ben Joyce for the Los Angeles Angels threw 105.5 miles per hour last weekend. Where do you go from there, Scott?
I think he was just put on the IL, so that's where you go.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, and that's the thing too, is you got guys out there throwing 105 and they're not throwing, well, they don't look like Mariano Rivera throwing 105. They're good, but they're not so overpowering 105.
Yeah. The problem with that is that sooner or later, the hitters are going to be able to catch up to it. They always do. And so like you said, where do you go from there? I think you really have to go back to, and I don't know if it will, but go back to teaching quality pitching, like a Greg Maddux type, school of pitching.
Who's throwing a knuckleball right now? Is it Waldron?
Waldron, yeah.
And that's it?
I think so. As long as I live, I'm always think, what if I really just spend a year and just really dedicate myself to a knuckleball? It seems almost achievable. That's my baseball novel that I'm going to write.
Yeah. Well, David Fletcher got cut from second base, and he got signed, I think, by the Braves as a knuckleballer. I mean, he's in the minors, but
yeah.
So I don't know. Well, I think you should try it, Scott.
You know what? I don't have any time anymore, but I'll quit the podcast and I'll just dedicate my whole life into throwing knuckleballs. Anyways, I want to bring it back, and you may or may not have an answer for this. Maybe you already answered this. Do you have a favorite baseball book?
Okay, so like I said, my favorite baseball book would be Ladies and Gentlemen, The Bronx is Burning. However, as an alternate, it's a book called Cardboard Gods. It's one of the more touching baseball stories I've read, and it's not about a player. It's just about a fan. It's about a young man's relationship with baseball growing up into his 40s or 50s with his brother, but it kind of his relationship with baseball and a broken family and trying to find his place in the world and trying to come over, some of the challenges that he had as a young man. And all of it is in the backdrop, explored through the baseball cards that had the most ridiculous expressions on them while he was growing up. So he explains all these childhood stories and these memories he has with his brother or something traumatic that happened with his second stepdad or whatever. But it's always tied around to, the title is, Bake McBride, or whichever ball player had the funny haircut or had some strange expression on their face that him and his brother laughed and howled at when they were kids. And so all of these associations with these old 1979 baseball cards, he kind of goes through this personal journey, and it's so well delivered and so personal. And like I mentioned, if Ladies and Gentlemen, The Bronx is Burning will turn you at least temporarily into a New York Yankees fan, Cardboard Gods will turn you temporarily into a Boston Red Sox fan. And so I would recommend it. I'm going to look it up while you're talking, and I'll tell you who wrote that.
Josh Wilker wrote it.
Oh,
I'm one step ahead of you.
Hey, very good.
Thank
you. Thank you.
Yeah,
that's pretty good.
Yeah, very nice. Yeah, I would recommend that. Would be the most favorite that I've read in recent memory.
That's one I've not heard of. That's great. I love that.
How did you know who wrote it? Oh, did you look it up?
I Googled it.
Oh, okay. I don't have a favorite baseball book, but I will say this. We've cracked into Why We Love Baseball by Joe Posnanski, and we're going to touch on it this season in our podcast. But this book is totally right in my wheelhouse, and it's a history of 50 great moments. And I can't wait to get into this book because I've read a couple of chapters and scrolled through some of them. It's going to be so much fun. So that's definitely going to be an appealing book to me. Yeah,
it's really a great book, and it's not just the 50 most famous moments either, which I think is a really great. I learned so much from that book. It's just almost every sentence is just like an incredible fact or story or something that I didn't know, all within these other 50 stories. So it's not, I think he said something like, yeah, it's like really more like 200 moments that are in these 50 moments. Yeah. But it's really, really a great book. It's a great entry point for baseball fans who are trying to get into reading baseball books, I think. Yeah. Do you write at all? Either one of you?
John writes.
I don't. I have. I've written a few short stories, but I'm not a writer. So
well, you've written. So
I would beg to differ. I've read a few of John's short stories and one of his anthology here, and I think it's dynamite. So I think if you wanted to craft and bang away at that, John, you certainly could. But I'll tell you, my personal take on writing is it's effing exhausting.
Yeah.
And I just, the madness, I think I can write all right, but it's just like, it's just compulsive and ugly and twitchy for me. I don't enjoy it.
It's a huge thing I've realized doing the podcast is that, I mean, there must be 80 to 100 baseball books that come out every year. And that is such an undertaking for every single one of those. That's years of their life and research and just toiling away. And I just wanted to be able to give them a platform where they would have.
Yeah, I love that.
It is so hard to do. I have so much respect for those guys.
10-4 on that. I agree 100%. And, just to add to that, we mentioned baseball book club, any authors, however big or small, we are willing to give it a spin. So if you reach out and you need a little exposure, we are more than happy to give it a minute. Even if it's on a hot corner, I'll give it 10 or 12 minutes. But I'm right with you on that, Scott, is that there's so much material and there's so many people who want to be heard. And everyone is just smothered under a million miles of, coverage. And so anything, sharing material or, just even giving any kind of exposure to be heard whatsoever is a delight. I'm sure you feel the same way, Scott, but it's a delight on our part,
Well, I hope that our listeners will now listen to you guys as well. This has been an absolute joy, guys. Thank you so much for the time. This has been awesome.
Thank you.
Oh, man, we appreciate it.
Thank you, Scott.
That was John Cheslock and Leroy Estep of the Baseball Book Club podcast, which comes out every Tuesday. We talk to people in and around baseball literature every week on the podcast and publish around 50 writers every year in the Twin Bill Literary Journal. You can support us on Patreon. Until next time,